if I could suggest anything, it would be getting to the place where you can look at the data from a place of information, not emotion. That would be really, really beneficial for all of us. And I'm talking to myself early in the journey. Podcast Growth Nation. Welcome back to another episode of Podcast Growth University, where we talk all things podcasting all the time. I hope you enjoyed the latest episode number 51. Why most shows never make money. I do not want that for you. I want you to get the result that you're longing for, whether it's more impact, more money, more opportunities, whatever it may be. Today, for episode number 52, happy 1-year anniversary, which is truly mind-blowing, is being obsessed with the numbers bad. I've had many conversations with many humans, and I hear that often. Somebody said this the other day. They said, I'm obsessed with the numbers. If only I could stop myself from looking. And I'm thinking to myself when I hear that, one, who told you that was a bad thing? Two, what does it mean to be obsessed with the numbers? And three, does it have to be a negative thing? So this is my thought. This will be a pretty easy episode. I'm guessing it'll probably be a short one too, but this is my thought process. If the short-term pain of your listens is stopping you from thinking long-term, it's probably not super productive or constructive for you to look at the numbers maybe as often as you are. But the other side of it is you do have to know what's going on. So I would say, what does it mean to be obsessed with the numbers? Do you check every day? I don't think that's a bad thing. If you check your bank account every day, I'd bet on you understanding money and not making unintelligent financial decisions long-term. I don't think that's a bad thing. Are you obsessed with your fitness if you check your weight every day? I don't know. I do it, and I found it very, very helpful. So I think the first thing is understanding, what does it mean to be obsessed? When a lot of people say obsessed, I think what they're actually saying is it affects my mood. When I look at the numbers and the numbers are low, I feel bad. Or it puts me in a place of anxiety because when I'm looking at the numbers, I want them to be higher, and I don't know how to make them get to the level I want them to get to. I think that really is where a lot of us are, because I remember what it was like. I would check our listens multiple times a day in the first couple years. And I remember having those feelings of, that kind of sucks. Nothing has changed. But I tried not to allow the short-term discomfort, the short-term, maybe disappointment is the best word for it. I tried not to allow the short-term disappointment to stop me from thinking of the long-term possibility. So if that's what we're talking about here, that's a different conversation. But at the end of the day, we need the data, right? I mean, there's no better way to track our growth than to look at the actual data. And 3 thoughts I have. 1, it'll allow us to figure out what guests are working. So what guest episodes are working? Okay, let's do this. I know people who, when they look at their stats, they see one of their guest episodes as a very, very high listens episode, and they say, this person must have shared. They didn't even know the person shared the episode. Okay, well, if you don't know that, then you can't invite them back on in a year with the hope that maybe they'll share again and you'll get another spike. So the first thing is checking on what guests are working. What are the results of the guest episodes that we're creating? The second thing is, what are the solo episodes that we're doing? If we're doing those, what's happening with those? Are we getting more listens on the solo episodes than we are on the guest episodes? Okay. Is it because of the titles? Do people want to hear more from you? I have a client who asked me a couple weeks ago. This person said, hey, I'm thinking of just doing solo episodes. I mean, my solo episodes get more downloads than my guest episodes. And it was obviously a deeper conversation, but I said, based on the data, if you want to make that decision, I don't think it's a bad one, short-term or long-term. Honestly, I think long-term, it's probably the right decision anyway. Short-term, you might see a little downturn in downloads, but it'll plateau and it'll eventually grow again. So, that's another thought. How do we know what's working if we don't look at the stats? How do we know what topics are working? Well, every time I talk about blank, we get a lot of listens. So for us, every time we talk about vulnerability on our podcast, it usually does really well. Relationships, those episodes usually do really well. Boundaries, those episodes usually do really well. But I wouldn't know that if I wasn't in the data. Now, this is what I'll tell you. I track our podcast listens every day. I track audio and YouTube. And then we just have it, I'll put the number in and it'll tell us how many we had overnight. All right. So yesterday we had 800,000 listens. Today we have 801,000 listens. Okay. We had 1,000 listens yesterday. Right. Cool. Then what I also do, maybe on a weekly basis, depends on how busy we are, but I like to go into our host. So we use Buzzsprout. I like to go in there and I like to look at, okay, what's happening? Like, what's the 30-day run rate? Okay, that's, we had X amount of downloads over the last 30 days. Cool. What's the last week look like? Do we have anything that's really interesting and it's piquing my interest? Like, why did that episode do really well? Why did these episodes not do really well? Are we having a down month? Are we having an up month? Right now, we're having a down month. So at Next Level U, we're having a down month. Our average, our downloads are below the normal average, but that's also because we have months where we're above the normal average. So I think that's the ultimate goal. If I could suggest anything, it would be getting to the place where you can look at the data from a place of information, not emotion. That would be really, really beneficial for all of us. And I'm talking to myself early in the journey. Early in the journey, I got sad. If we had a bad day, I would get very, very sad. It doesn't mean you're failing. It doesn't mean you're not going to be successful. It just means maybe it's time to change something. Or maybe it's not time to change something, depending. So that is really the quote I would have for this episode. If the short-term pain, the short-term discomfort, the short-term disappointment is stopping you from thinking of the long-term potential, and it's affecting your day-to-day and the way you show up, one, I think the goal is to shift the relationship, right? To rebuild the relationship with what looking at the numbers actually means.
I just wanted to take a quick second and give a shout out and a huge thank you to Next Level Podcasting Solutions, Kevin and his team. They have been incredible to work with, very flexible, on the spot with any questions that I have or any concerns that I have. When I first started out my podcast, I was doing everything on my own. I have no editing background. I have no podcasting background. I knew nothing about it. And so I was bootstrapping all of this myself while I was still trying to take on my role as a full-time mom. And once I met up with Kevin and we had these discussions and I got on board with adding an editing team, oh my goodness, it just lifted this weight off of me. It lifted my time that I was spending doing my editing. And in the beginning, full transparency, when I was editing just my individual recordings, it was a little more manageable, not super manageable. And then when I started doing my interviews for the podcast, it was hours upon hours of me doing the editing that didn't include any of the promotional material that I am now getting from Kevin and his team. It wouldn't have been sustainable. I would not have been able to keep up with that. So I recommend Kevin and his team. They have done wonderful work in helping me grow my podcast. I have really enjoyed working with the editing team, and it definitely feels like more of a team environment versus me hiring them to do a specific job. I mean, we all work collaboratively on the projects that I have, and I have these crazy ideas sometimes, and they come up with a solution to fit my needs. I can't recommend them enough. I really enjoyed working with them. Kevin and the Next Level Podcasting Solutions, thank you so much for the work that you have done in the past and are continuing to do for me. I'm growing this community and growing this platform with a beautiful team that is working for me and with me to see my vision and help that come to life. So thank you again so much. I really appreciate you guys.
This is a good analogy or a good example. When I start dieting and I'm really on tracking my weight and tracking every calorie and all that, I tend to gain weight in the very beginning. And you might say, well, yeah, wouldn't you be better not tracking? No, because now I know that that's how it works for me. Usually I'll gain a pound or two, and then it starts going from there. It's good to have that data because now when I'm tracking, I can take the emotion out of it. the emotion is out of it. It's just, this is just how it works usually. And you can graph it out to see how it looks. So I don't think being obsessed with the numbers is bad as long as the short-term discomfort doesn't stop you from thinking long-term. And there's just so many hints and tricks and tips in the data. That's what I do with a lot of clients. We look at their data. And a lot of them have never looked before. They've never looked at the data. I've talked to people all the time. How many listens do you have? And they'll say, I don't even know. Okay, that's okay. It's not the end of the world. But it would benefit you to know because a lot of people are actually more successful than they think. And there's also other people who are less successful than they think, or they have less of the results than they think. But we can't really create accurate expectations if we don't have accurate data. And this is a really good thought. If you think you have 1,000 downloads and you actually have 10,000 downloads, how differently would you feel? You probably would be a lot more positive. And then the question from there is, okay, well, how do we get the 10,000 downloads to convert to clients or money or whatever it is? That's a whole nother conversation. The other conversation is the numbers are what they are, and it's your job and your goal to try to get the most out of every number you have. So for every listener you have, the goal is to get them to join the group or whatever next is, whatever the ultimate goal is. You could get 1 million downloads tomorrow, and if the system isn't set up correctly, it's not necessarily going to convert where you want it to. So that's another interesting thing is I think a lot of us believe, if I only got 1 million downloads today, everything would be fine. It's not as like that as you probably think. And just based on what I've seen and based on what we've seen, you got to have the right systems in place. So what I would suggest is you first work on your relationship with what the numbers actually mean, and I would make it a habit. I think it's important. I think it's very important to know what's going on. I track our finances every day in the business. That's important. Now, when some days I track and we make a lot of money that day. Other days I track, we don't make any money that day. It's okay because now I can kind of disconnect my emotion from that logic. So that's what I would say. Is being obsessed with the numbers bad? If it stops you from doing this for a long time, probably. If it makes you feel really, really, really bad, okay, what can we do to rebuild that? But at the end of the day, we need data. And this is the other interesting thing too about the podcast industry. The data isn't great. YouTube has really good data where this is where people dropped off and their data is just better than the podcast industry. So as the data gets better, it gets more powerful, it gets more valuable because you can actually take something from it. So yeah, I would say track them. Track your listens every day if it is sustainable for you. That way you know. It's one of the interesting things about looking at the data is you'll see, oh, interesting. As a self-improvement podcast, around the holidays, we always get more listens. Why? Or the beginning of the summer, we tend to get less listens. Why? That's a very good thing to understand because that's another layer of awareness where I can disassociate the result from my emotions. So yeah, I think tracking is the most important thing you can be doing other than actually doing all the physical stuff. You will benefit greatly from it as long as you can separate emotion from logic. As always, my friends, I would love to hop on a free 30-minute podcast breakthrough session. I did 3 or 4 last week, and they were very, very, very fun. I always start them out by saying, based on where you are today and where you want to get to eventually, what do you believe is the most valuable use of our time? I want to make sure I'm adding value based on where you are, right? I might know a lot, but it doesn't really matter if I'm not adding value based on where you are. I don't want to go in a million directions. I want to go in the direction that is going to be most valuable for you. So as always, the link will be in the show notes. Please, if you have been thinking about it, maybe now is the time. I'd love to chat. Next week for episode number 53, we are going to talk about keeping it simple and keeping it small. One of the reasons a lot of us don't make it is because we're focused on these massive pieces of growth and these massive things that we think have to happen, and we overcomplicate things and our expectations are all over the place. And if it's not sustainable for you to start, it's going to be really, really hard to be consistent doing it. So in the next episode, I want to talk about that. How do we keep it simple? How do we keep the growth small? in terms of what we're doing from an effort perspective. Because at the end of the day, here's the thing, right? This is a very interesting thing. I've done this podcast every week for 52 weeks. So every week for a year. In the grand scheme of things, it's not that long. A year, I mean, imagine if you only did 52 workouts. It's not that many workouts. You're not going to see that many results. But what are you doing in between or during every episode or for your social media or for your Facebook group every day to make it a little bit better, every week to make it a little bit better, every month to make it a little bit better? That's what I mean by keeping it simple and keeping it small. So we will talk about that next week. All the love. I appreciate you all very, very, very much. 1 year down and many, many more to go. Thank you as always, and we will talk to you next week.